The Trump administration's move on the Columbia River Treaty could put one of North America's most important water and power deals under the most pressure it has faced in decades. If you live in the United States or Canada, this fight can touch your electricity bill, your flood risk, your food prices, and your country's control over water. The viral headline says Trump ended Canada's water treaty, but the verified record shows something more complicated, and maybe more dangerous. Because rivers do not pause for politics, and when a water treaty turns into a sovereignty fight, every dam, every salmon run, every farm, and every megawatt becomes leverage. The river at the center of this story is the Columbia River. Not Columbia the country, Columbia, the massive river system that begins in British Columbia, flows through the American Northwest, and helps power one of the most important regions in North America. For most people, this river is not part of daily political debate. But for the Pacific Northwest, it is not just water. It is electricity. It is flood protection. It is irrigation. It is shipping. It is salmon. It is indigenous history. It is farmland. It is industry. And now it is becoming part of a much bigger fight over sovereignty, energy, and US-Canada trust. For 61 years, Canada and the United States have managed this river through the Columbia River Treaty. The treaty was signed in 1961, ratified and brought into force in 1964, and built around a very simple bargain. Canada would store huge amounts of water upstream in British Columbia. The United States would benefit downstream through flood protection and more reliable hydropower generation. In return, Canada would receive compensation through power benefits and flood control payments. That bargain reshaped the region. Canada built the Duncan, Hugh Keenley Side, and Mica dams. The United States built Libby Dam in Montana, creating Lake Koocanusa, a reservoir that crosses the border. These projects gave the United States more control over downstream flooding and helped make hydropower production more predictable. But the benefits came with costs. Land was flooded, communities were moved, ecosystems were changed. First Nations and indigenous communities were deeply affected. And by today's standards, the people most connected to the river were not properly included in the original process. That is why modernization became so important. The old treaty was designed for the priorities of the 1960s, flood control and electricity. But the world has changed. Climate risks are worse. Salmon recovery is now central to the debate. Indigenous and First Nations participation can no longer be treated as an afterthought. Power demand is rising. And the Northwest grid is now being asked to support not just homes and factories, but also data centers, chip facilities, and a growing digital economy. So in July 2024, under President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the United States and Canada reached an agreement in principle to update the treaty. That was not a final signed amendment. It was not the completed deal, but it was a major step. The new framework was supposed to update flood risk management, power sharing, climate planning, ecosystem work, salmon recovery, and indigenous involvement. Then the Trump administration came in, and in March 2025, British Columbia said the United States had paused modernization talks, while the new administration reviewed international commitments. That is the verified action. A pause, a review, a freeze in the process, not confirmed formal treaty termination, not a proven cancellation of the treaty itself, not a legal ending based on the public record. That distinction matters. The Columbia River Treaty has no fixed end date. Either country can seek termination with 10 years notice after September 2024, but a formal termination notice has not been proven. So when people say, Trump ended Canada's 61-year water treaty, that goes beyond what is verified. But do not mistake that correction for comfort, because a treaty can remain alive on paper while the trust around it starts breaking down, and that is the real danger here. Power planners do not operate on political slogans. Dam operators do not manage flood risk based on press conference language. Farmers do not plan irrigation around diplomatic uncertainty. Indigenous governments do not hear the word pause as neutral when they have already waited generations for proper inclusion. And utilities do not like uncertainty around one of the most important hydropower systems in North America. The Columbia River Basin has been a giant in U.S. hydroelectric power. The U.S. Energy Information Administration has reported that in 2012, hydroelectric plants in the Columbia River Basin produced 44% of total U.S. hydroelectric generation. That is where the 40% of U.S. hydropower framing comes from. But here's the important correction. That does not mean 40% of American hydropower is about to disappear overnight. It means the basin is so important that any long-term uncertainty around its operating rules matters. There is a difference between a threat and a shutdown. A shutdown means the power stops now. That is not what the verified record shows. A threat means the rules become uncertain, the relationship becomes unstable, and future planning becomes harder. That is what this pause has created. And in a region where power demand is already rising, that uncertainty lands at a very bad time. The Pacific Northwest is seeing pressure from population growth, electrification, industry, and especially data centers. These facilities need huge amounts of reliable electricity. They do not care about speeches. They care about power that is available every hour of the day. Hydropower matters because it is flexible. When demand jumps, dams can ramp up. When wind power drops, hydro can help fill the gap. When a cold snap hits and heaters switch on across the region, the grid needs fast supply. When the economy adds more data centers and chip facilities, planners need to know what the river system can support. That is why this treaty is not just about water. It is about the future of energy. For American viewers, the question is not only whether Canada is getting too much under the treaty. The question is whether the United States can afford instability in one of its most important clean power regions at the same time electricity demand is rising. For Canadian viewers, the question is different but just as serious. It is whether Canada is being respected as the upstream country that carries the storage burden, takes on the land impacts, and helps create downstream benefits for the United States. Canada does not simply give water to America. Canada stores water. Canada manages reservoirs. Canada absorbs costs. Canada carries history. That is why the compensation issue matters. Canada receives annual power benefits, often described as the Canadian entitlement, worth roughly hundreds of millions of dollars per year depending on market conditions. The United States also prepaid $64.4 million for flood control storage through 2024. These numbers are not small, but neither are the benefits the US receives from coordinated storage and flow management. So the fight is not just about money, it is about whether the old bargain still feels fair in a new era. And this is where Trump's language about water becomes important. President Trump has made comments about a giant faucet that could supposedly send northern or Pacific Northwest water toward California. Experts have disputed that framing because there is no simple water system that just sends Columbia River water to Southern California. The geography, infrastructure, law, and engineering do not work like a household tap. But politically, the comment mattered. Because when an American president talks loosely about northern water, and then his administration pauses talks on a major shared river treaty, Canadians hear something bigger than a technical review. They hear pressure. They hear resource politics. They hear the possibility that water is becoming the next front in a much wider US-Canada fight. And that is why Mark Carney's broader sovereignty message matters. The verified record does not show Carney personally stopping Trump on this treaty in some dramatic one-on-one showdown. That would be overstated. But Carney's political brand has been built around defending Canadian sovereignty, protecting strategic interests, and warning that Canada cannot simply assume the old US relationship will always work the same way. So the accurate story is not that Carney flipped a switch and blocked a water grab. The accurate story is more grounded and more serious. Trump's administration paused treaty modernization. Canada now has to decide how hard to push back, and a river system that once symbolized cooperation is now being pulled into a larger argument about power, trust, and sovereignty. This situation is moving fast. By the time mainstream media covers the full picture, the moment to understand it will have passed. Subscribe so you are always ahead of the story, not catching up to it. Because the fight over the Columbia is a preview of how the US and Canada may fight over water, energy, and strategic resources in the years ahead. Now look at what modernization was supposed to fix. The original treaty focused mainly on two things: flood control and power generation. Those were the core issues when the deal came into force in 1964. But today, the river is being asked to do much more. It has to support electricity. It has to support irrigation. It has to support shipping. It has to protect communities from floods. It has to support salmon. It has to respect Indigenous rights and First Nations priorities. It has to adapt to climate change. And it has to support a regional economy that is using more power every year. That is a lot to ask from one river system. And the older the treaty gets, the more obvious its gaps become. Salmon are one of those gaps. They are not just an environmental issue. They are food, culture, treaty rights, identity, and history. For Indigenous peoples on both sides of the border, salmon are tied to a way of life that existed long before the dams and long before the modern border. The dams brought benefits. They generated electricity. They helped control floods. They supported economic growth. But they also changed the river. They changed migration routes, water temperatures, habitat, and fish survival. Modernization was never going to magically solve every salmon problem, but it was supposed to bring ecosystem concerns into the center of the conversation instead of leaving them on the side. The pause threatens that momentum. It also threatens Indigenous participation. The original treaty process did not properly include First Nations and Indigenous communities. That is not a minor historical detail. It is one of the reasons modernization became so important in the first place. The new process was supposed to give Indigenous voices a stronger role in shaping the future of the river. When negotiations pause, those communities are once again left waiting. And that creates a painful question. When the U.S. reviews international commitments through a narrower national interest lens, what happens to the issues that do not fit neatly into old power calculations? What happens to salmon? What happens to cultural values? What happens to First Nations priorities? What happens to long-term climate planning? Those are not side issues. They are the future of the treaty. But there is also a counterpoint that needs to be said. A new U.S. administration has the right to review international agreements. Treaties that affect power payments, flood control, and long-term national resources deserve scrutiny. American ratepayers have a real interest in whether the Canadian entitlement is fair. U.S. officials have every right to ask whether the old formulas still match modern conditions. A review by itself is not automatically reckless. The problem is the political atmosphere around the review. This pause did not happen in a calm relationship. It happened after months of tension between Washington and Ottawa. It happened in a period of tariff threats, sovereignty warnings, and harder language about allies. It happened while Trump was using aggressive rhetoric about resources and trade. So even if the official explanation is review, the political signal looks much sharper. To Canada, it can look like pressure. To the United States, Canada's response can look like resistance. And once both sides start seeing the river through that lens, a technical negotiation can become a national test of strength. That is dangerous because neither country has a simple win button. The United States cannot just demand more control and ignore Canada's upstream role. Canada cannot simply turn off the river without legal, physical, and economic consequences. The Columbia River is not a tap. It is a managed system. It has dams, reservoirs, obligations, flows, forecasts, communities, and decades of planning built around it. Every move creates a countermove. Every demand has a cost. Every political slogan runs into engineering reality. Do you think the United States should use treaty talks to demand a better deal, or does that risk damaging trust with its closest neighbor? And if you are in Canada, do you think Ottawa should draw harder red lines around water, or keep trying to repair the relationship with Washington? That debate is not theoretical anymore. If modernization remains stalled, several things could happen. The simplest path is that the U.S. review ends, both sides return to the table, and the 2024 agreement in principle becomes the basis for a final, updated deal. That is still possible. Both countries benefit from coordination. The U.S. needs predictable flood control and power operations. Canada needs fair compensation and respect for its upstream position. Indigenous nations need meaningful participation. Ecosystems need long-term planning. That is the best-case scenario. The harder path is a long delay. In that case, the treaty stays in force, but the future framework remains unfinished. The old system continues, but everyone knows it is outdated. Utilities plan around uncertainty. Local communities wait. Indigenous and First Nations leaders push for clarity. Environmental groups warn about salmon and ecosystem delays. Canadian officials become more suspicious of U.S. intentions. American regional leaders pressure Washington to restore momentum. That kind of delay can do real damage even without a formal treaty collapse. Then there is the most serious path, formal termination notice. Again, this has not been confirmed, but after September 2024, either country can seek termination with 10 years notice. If that ever happens, the clock starts. 10 years may sound long, but for power systems, flood maps, dam operations, transmission planning, and ecosystem recovery, it is not long at all. The treaty would not simply vanish overnight. Certain flood control arrangements would still matter, and the system would not become instant chaos. But the operating environment would change. Flood control could become more complicated. Compensation could change. Power coordination could become less predictable. Trust could fall even further. And once a country gives formal termination notice, it is very hard to pretend the relationship has not changed. That is why the current pause matters. It is not the final explosion. It is the warning tremor. It tells us that the US and Canada are entering a period where even long-standing agreements are no longer protected from political pressure. It tells us that water, electricity, and climate planning are now part of the same sovereignty debate as tariffs, trade, borders, defense, and supply chains. And it tells us something even bigger. The old assumption that Washington and Ottawa will always solve shared resource problems quietly may no longer hold. For the United States, that should be worrying. America's economy depends on reliable infrastructure. The Pacific Northwest depends on predictable water and power planning. Farmers, utilities, cities, ports, and industries all need a stable river system. If Washington treats the treaty mainly as leverage, it may create problems for its own people. For Canada, this is also a warning. Canada has enormous resources: water, electricity, minerals, energy, farmland, forests, and Arctic access. In a more unstable world, those resources become more valuable. But value also brings pressure. If Canada wants to protect sovereignty, it has to know which agreements still serve its national interest and which ones need stronger terms. For Indigenous nations, the message is sharper. They have already seen what happens when governments make river decisions without them. Modernization was supposed to be part of a correction. A pause risks repeating the old pattern. Big governments arguing over benefits, while the people with the deepest connection to the river wait outside the final room. For the global order, the signal is clear. If the US and Canada struggle to manage a shared river after 61 years of treaty cooperation, what does that say about harder resource disputes around the world? What does it say to countries fighting over rivers in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Middle East? What does it say to allies watching whether US commitments survive a change in administration? Water is becoming strategic. Electricity is becoming strategic. Food is becoming strategic. Data centers are making power even more valuable. Climate change is making river systems harder to manage. That is the world this treaty now sits inside. So yes, the viral headline is too dramatic if it claims the treaty has already been legally ended. But the deeper warning is real. Trump's administration has paused the modernization process. Canada is now watching closely. The Columbia River system remains central to U.S. hydropower, flood control, agriculture, salmon recovery, and Northwest growth. The modernization deal that was supposed to update the system for climate, indigenous rights, ecosystem health, and power sharing is unfinished. And the longer that pause lasts, the more this becomes about something bigger than one treaty. It becomes about whether the United States and Canada still know how to share power, literally and politically. Most people following this story are getting the surface version. Subscribers here get the full picture, what it means, why it matters, and what is coming next. Do not settle for half the story, because the next phase of US-Canada conflict may not look like a trade war at first. It may look like a water meeting, a power contract, a dam operation plan, or a treaty review that suddenly becomes a sovereignty test. So here is where the story stands. Trump has not been proven to have legally ended the Columbia River Treaty, but his administration's pause has created real uncertainty around one of North America's most important water and power systems. Canada cannot simply turn off the river, and America cannot pretend Canada's upstream role is optional. The treaty is still alive, but the trust needed to modernize it is under pressure. The next question is whether this pause ends with a stronger agreement, or whether it becomes the first step toward a much bigger North American fight over water, electricity, and sovereignty. In my next video, I am covering how Canada's new energy strategy could turn electricity into its strongest weapon against US pressure, and what I found will change how you see this.